So I was 21 the first time I sat down with a World War II veteran to listen to his stories. And when I was 18, I had left Texas and come to Belgium as an exchange student for a year, where I had fallen in love. And at the time, I was back in Texas studying at the university. This veteran I met, when he was 18, he had had a very different experience of traveling abroad. The US Army had basically taught him how to do everything with a knife except butter bread, in his own words. And they had dropped him by an airplane into the countryside in Normandy. He was going to live with a French farmer and work with the French resistance for a year before the Allied landings. And at that time, he too fell in love with a French woman. They stayed together after the liberation for a while, but as I'm sure several of you in this room probably understand, cross-cultural relationships have their challenges. And so after a time, they separated and he returned to the United States, where he quickly married afterwards. Now, the US government basically told him he was not allowed to talk about what he had done during the war for 50 years. So at the time that I met him, he was in his 70s, and he had just been given permission to start sharing his experiences from the war. And all of these memories started coming back, and they were overwhelming him and his wife and family. And as I sat across the table from him, listening to him tell me about this long-lost French love, his wife of 45 years or more was in the kitchen banging away on the on the chairs and the dishes, and she came out to the table and she said, "Why does he have to talk about this? It just makes him depressed. The war is over. The past is in the past. We have to move on with our lives." And I thought, what do I say? How do I respond other than thank you for sharing your memories with me? It's important for my generation to know what happened. And as I walked away, I thought, wow, what do I do? This is, far from the history that was always these far removed dates and events in some dusty textbook. He had opened the pages. He had breathed life into the words. And history, all of a sudden, was his story. And it was her story. It was their story. And I started to wonder, what would mine be? So a year later, at the 50th anniversary of the D-Day commemorations, an American journalist, Katie Couric, actually asked me on live TV, "Erin, how did spending time with these veterans have an impact on your life?" Well, I designed my own degree in college to focus on World War II studies, and I had planned to get my PhD. Life, of course, had other plans for me. Curiosity had lured me out of Texas, and love settled me here in Belgium. And 20 years later, over 20 years later, my husband and I are raising 4 bilingual and very multicultural children, whom we take on vacation to the beach in Normandy several times a year. So a few years ago, when my daughter was old enough to actually kind of climb down off one of the tanks and go, "Mom, what happened here?" I started to think, what can we learn from D-Day? And how can D-Day help us today? Because I believe that, we are living in a very unpredictable world right now. And while I do not believe that we are condemned to repeat the past, I believe that we have a lot we can learn from the past. People are drawing parallels between Europe of the 1930s and the populist movements that are happening right now in the world very often. And I stop and I wonder, where is it going to go? What's it going to lead to? How far is this going to take us? What's going to happen? We're at a turning point. And what is our future going to be? Sorry. When I think about these things, I often get emotional, and I often feel like it's overwhelming, that it's impossible. How is anything that I could say or do going to make a difference in the world? And how will I ever fill those boots or grow into them? In 1942, Hitler's Germany, Nazi Germany, and Mussolini in Italy, they had taken over, they controlled all of continental Europe. The Soviet Union was fighting very hard on the Eastern Front, and the Western Allies were basically sitting, completely pushed off the continent, and were sitting in the United Kingdom trying to figure out, what are we going to do with this situation? They knew that the only way they were going to be able to weaken Hitler's forces would be to open a second front on the western side of Europe, but that meant making a sea invasion somewhere. So what do you do when what you're facing seems like an impossible task, when nothing in your current circumstances says you're going to be able to do it? This is what the Allies were facing, and in January of 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, sorry, Theodore's a little older by then, they joined together to announce a common Anglo-American strategy for the war. And they said at that conference that they would make a cross-channel invasion into Europe. But at the time, nothing in their circumstances at the time said it was going to be possible. The U-boats were completely dominating the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't have the air supremacy that they would need for any type of beach landing. They didn't even have the technology to physically land troops on the beaches and then supply them afterwards. They didn't even have history on their side, because in 1944, there had only been 2 successful cross-channel invasions in all of history. And the most recent one before 1944, anyone? 1066, William the Conqueror. So, my God, what are they, right? But here they are, making their press conference, stating to the world, we're going to do this. Even though we don't know how we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And 18 months later, they did. And when we look back in the past, we think, well, of course D-Day was a success, and of course the Allies won the war. But at the time, it was anything but obvious that that was going to happen. And these generals, they knew that there was going to be a lot of obstacles they were going to have to climb over to make this happen. But D-Day was conceived in a very unpredictable and unstable world. And if we can look back at how they made that happen, how they created their response to the situation, how they made history, we might be able to start to look at how we can make our own. So number 1, know what you stand for. Any challenge is going to require persistence and commitment, and you have to know why you're doing it. And when you tell other people what you stand for, it allows them the chance to stand with you. General Eisenhower, who was head of the European Theater of Operations, he knew the importance of this, and he knew the importance of allies. And he made it clear to every soldier who was going to fight on D-Day why they were fighting and that who was there supporting them. Women and men, citizens and soldiers, children and adults all stood up together for what they believed in. And you know what? It's really scary. But when you know why you're doing something, it helps you step forward alongside that fear. And it even helps you sometimes make light of the situation. But if you don't know why, you may never try. So what do you stand for? Number 2, to get good answers, ask good questions. Walls have been made all through time in history, but they rarely withstand the test of time. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, as you can see, was built to defend the whole western coast of Europe. And the Allies, they quickly found out that hitting that wall head on was not going to work. When they tried to take the port of Dieppe in France in 1942, it was a complete disaster. All the ports along the Atlantic Wall were so heavily defended. But to make a successful landing, the Allies needed an operating port very quickly, because it wasn't just about getting the soldiers on the beach, but then you had to be able to reinforce those soldiers and you had to be able to supply them. So they realized, well, if we try to take a port, we're going to destroy it in the process. So what are we going to do? Is it possible? How can we make a wall obsolete? Churchill said, well, if we can't take a port, we'll just bring one with us. What, bring a port with you? Yeah, we can do that. And in this memo that he writes, he says it, he frames the question so perfectly, because he's not asking, can we build a floating port? He's saying, show me how. And in that framing, he set up one of the greatest engineering feats of the 20th century, the floating harbor, or the Mulberry Harbor, that was built in Arromanches. They call it Port Winston in his name. And they literally built elements of this port in England and towed them across the channel as they were doing the invasion. And within days, this port was up and running. The technology that they developed for that time is still used today in oil rig platforms around the world. And the remnants of that harbor that are still there today are there as a symbol to the power of creative thinking, and that walls can be made obsolete by open minds, and asking the right questions. So what happens when you replace can I with how can I? Number 3, freedom is not controlling the content of your life. Freedom is creating the context. Just as this paratrooper talks about what he did on D-Day, I listened to many veterans tell their stories over the years. And hardly any of them, chose to be in the war. Life's circumstances put them there. And how they responded to those circumstances and the context of their experiences, how they put their experiences into a context, into a story, how that impacted the rest of their lives, watching that was more powerful than any one specific story that they told me. We've all done things that we're proud of and other things that we're not so proud of. And there are victims and perpetrators on every side of the story. There are multiple perspectives to every event. Facts are facts. They're like bricks. You can't deny them, but they're there, and you can pick them up, and you can look at them and study them from different angles. And by understanding them, perhaps that also helps change the weight of those bricks and the weight that you carry with you. And it also allows you to think about how to place them, to build a foundation upon which you will then create your future. Viktor Frankl survived 4 different Nazi concentration camps. And he teaches us that we don't just have to react to what happens in life, that we have the power to pause and to choose our response. Because life is not what happens to you, life is what you make of what happens. So what will you create with the content of your life? What happens, the power of what's going on, what was existed in the past, and the change in the reality of what's happening today can be very destabilizing. And we question, how do we prepare for this unforeseeable future, this unpredictable? In a time of uncertainty, these veterans, they knew what they stood for. And in a time when they didn't know how they were going to do something, they asked the right questions to help them innovate the tools they needed. And through personal leadership and responsibility, they understood the power of how they would respond to the situation. Telling the story of D-Day has awoken in myself the realization of the creative power that I hold in my life and the innate freedom that I have to respond, to choose my response to whichever situation and whichever challenge comes my way. And that by responding and choosing that response, I am creating my future history that my children can learn from. It's not about, your story isn't written by all the answers that you've figured out. It's by living through the questions. So what kind of stories do you want to look back on later in your life? And how does that influence the choices you make today? Because I would say, ensure that your future history is kind to you and create it yourself. Thank you.